Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's journey, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's most fascinating stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now settle in, maybe grab a drink, and let's step back into a world where dinner wasn't just a meal, but a declaration of absolute power. Picture this. You're a foreign diplomat in the 13th century, and you've just received the most terrifying invitation of your life. Not to a battlefield, not to a siege, but to dinner. Because when the great Khan of the Mongol Empire invites you to feast, you're not just being asked to eat. You're being summoned to witness the appetite of a man who consumed entire civilizations for breakfast and still had room for dessert. Feeding Kublai Khan wasn't cooking. It was empire management with extra seasoning. His palace kitchens in what we now call Beijing weren't some cozy medieval hearth where a pot of stew bubbled peacefully over the fire. They were sprawling, smoke-choked industrial complexes that operated like military campaigns, staffed by thousands of cooks, butchers, servers, and unfortunate apprentices who spent most of their lives elbow deep in animal entrails and political terror. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. The Mongols didn't start as gourmet food critics. They began as nomadic herders on the steppes, surviving on a diet so simple it would make a modern minimalist weep with envy. Yet somehow, through conquest and cultural absorption, they created one of history's most extravagant culinary empires. Tonight, we're going to explore how a people who once drank fermented horse milk and ate meat cooked under their saddles transformed into hosts of the most elaborate feast the medieval world had ever seen. The story begins not in gilded palaces, but on the endless grasslands of Mongolia, where survival meant understanding two fundamental truths. First, your animals were more valuable alive than dead. Second, everything you ate fell into one of two categories that would shape Mongol culture forever. They called them Ulaan ID and Tagayan ID, red foods and white foods, blood and milk, winter and summer, life and death. The white foods were the foundation of Mongol existence. Fermented mare's milk, known as airag, wasn't just a beverage. It was liquid currency, social lubricant, and proof of wealth, all rolled into one slightly alcoholic, fizzy nightmare that foreign visitors described with the kind of diplomatic politeness usually reserved for avoiding international incidents. Making airag required up to 60 horses for a season's supply, which meant that drinking it regularly wasn't just about taste. It was about flaunting the fact that you owned enough horses to literally drink your wealth. The process was both art and endurance test. Mongol women would churn mare's milk in massive leather bags for hours, using wooden paddles that transformed fresh milk into something that bubbled and fermented and probably haunted the dreams of anyone brave enough to try it. Modern visitors to Mongolia describe the taste as an acquired one, which is diplomatic speak, for it tastes like carbonated regret with a hint of barnyard. But airag was just the beginning of the white food empire. The Mongols mastered dairy in ways that would make a Wisconsin cheesemaker weep with admiration. They created butter that could survive desert crossings, cheese so hard it could double as armor, and yogurt thick enough to use as mortar. Every drop of milk from their sheep, goats, camels, and yaks was transformed into something useful because waste wasn't just impractical on the steppes, it was potentially fatal. Then came the red foods, and this is where things get interesting. The Mongols ate meat from every animal they owned, but not in the way you might expect. These weren't people who slaughtered animals casually. Every death was calculated, ritualized, and done with a precision that bordered on the sacred. When a Mongol butcher killed a sheep or goat, he made a tiny incision in the chest, reached inside, and pinched off the aorta. No blood spilled, no unnecessary suffering. The animal died instantly, and every drop of blood was preserved. This wasn't just about efficiency. It was about respect for the spiritual world that surrounded them. The butchering had to be done outdoors, but in shadow, so the sun wouldn't witness it. No blood could touch the earth, lest the spirits be offended. For larger animals like oxen, they used sledgehammers to strike between the horns, again ensuring no blood was wasted. These elaborate precautions reveal something profound about Mongol culture. They understood that taking life, even for survival, carried weight. The cooking methods that emerged from this philosophy were ingenious adaptations to life without trees, without permanent hearths, without the luxury of staying in one place long enough to perfect complex recipes. Since the steppes offered little fuel beyond dried animal dung, the Mongols became masters of boiling rather than roasting. But when they did roast, they created techniques that sound like something from a survival reality show. Picture this. You're a Mongol warrior on the move, and you've just killed a wild sheep. Instead of building an elaborate fire and waiting hours for it to cook, you stuff the animal with heated stones, sew it up in its own hide, and let the internal heat do the work. The result was perfectly cooked meat that retained all its juices and required no external fuel beyond what was needed to heat the stones. This technique, which they called budog, is still practiced in Mongolia today, a direct link to culinary methods that fed the greatest land empire in human history. But the real genius of Mongol food culture wasn't in their cooking. It was in their classification system. Everything edible fell into those two categories, red and white, and the timing of when you ate what wasn't arbitrary. It was a sophisticated understanding of nutrition and seasonal availability that modern dietitians are only beginning to appreciate. Summer was white food season, when the mares were producing milk and the pastures were green. The Mongols lived primarily on dairy products. Arag flowed like water. Fresh cheese provided protein, and butter gave them the fats they needed for energy. This wasn't just about availability. Summer dairy consumption allowed their herds to grow and multiply without the pressure of constant slaughter for meat. Winter brought the red foods. When temperatures dropped and milk production slowed, the Mongols switched to a heavily meat-based diet that provided the protein and fat necessary to survive brutal steppe winters. They had developed what modern nutritionists would recognize as a perfectly adapted seasonal eating pattern, long before anyone understood the science behind it. The variety of red foods in their diet would surprise anyone who thinks of the Mongols as simple meat and potatoes people. They ate sheep, goats, horses, camels, yaks, and whatever wild game they could hunt. Each animal provided different nutritional benefits, and the Mongols understood these differences intuitively. Horse meat was prized for its strength-giving properties. Mutton was the everyday staple. Camel meat was saved for special occasions, partly because camels were too valuable as transportation to slaughter casually. They even had emergency food sources that sound like something from a survival manual. When traditional food ran short, Mongol warriors would make a small cut in their horse's neck and drink a few gulps of blood before sealing the wound. It wasn't enough to harm the horse, but it provided essential nutrients and protein that could mean the difference between life and death on a long campaign. This brings us to one of the most famous Mongol food innovations, one that supposedly gave rise to a dish that's still found on menus worldwide today. Steak tartare, that delicacy of raw minced beef that makes squeamish diners everywhere question their life choices, allegedly has its origins in Mongol military logistics. According to medieval chroniclers, Mongol riders would place raw meat under their saddles before long rides. The constant motion and pressure would pound out all the blood and flatten the meat into something resembling a very primitive steak. Whether this story is true or just medieval propaganda designed to make the Mongols seem more exotic and barbaric, it captures something essential about their relationship with food. Every meal was an exercise in efficiency. Every cooking method was designed for mobility. Every food choice was calculated to provide maximum nutrition with minimum waste. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The same people who perfected the art of cooking meat under their saddles were about to encounter the most sophisticated cuisines in the known world. As the Mongol Empire expanded across Asia, these nomadic herders found themselves rulers of agricultural societies with culinary traditions spanning thousands of years. Imagine the cultural shock. One day you're drinking fermented mare's milk in a felt tent, and the next, you're sitting in a Chinese palace being offered delicate rice wines and elaborately prepared dishes that require ingredients imported from across continents. Most conquerors would have either rejected these foreign foods entirely or abandoned their own traditions completely. The Mongols did something far more interesting. They absorbed, adapted, and transformed everything they encountered into something uniquely their own. This is where our story of feeding the great Khan truly begins. Because when Kublai Khan established his court in China, he didn't just inherit an empire. He inherited the responsibility of creating a cuisine that could represent the diversity and power of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Every meal became a political statement. Every dish was a demonstration of cultural dominance. Every feast was an exercise in imperial theater that would make modern state dinners look like casual backyard barbecues. The transformation was staggering. Within a single generation, the descendants of people who cooked meat and animal hides were hosting banquets that featured dishes requiring dozens of exotic spices, cooking techniques borrowed from a half dozen different cultures, and presentation styles that turned dinner into performance art. The kitchens that emerged from this cultural collision weren't just cooking spaces, they were laboratories of imperial fusion, where Chinese techniques met Persian spices, where Mongol practicality collided with sophisticated presentation, and where the simple act of preparing dinner became an exercise in managing the appetites of half the known world. Picture the logistics alone. To feed a single imperial banquet, entire regions became supply chains. Chinese farmers shipped rice and tea by the ton. Central Asian herders drove endless processions of sheep and horses toward the capital, knowing their animals were destined for the imperial spit. Persian merchants arrived with caravans loaded with saffron, cinnamon, and other spices worth their weight in silver. Even ice was carved from distant mountains and stored in underground chambers because nothing demonstrated absolute power quite like serving chilled drinks the middle of summer. The scale was mind-boggling. Contemporary accounts suggest that the imperial kitchens slaughtered hundreds of animals every single day, not for special occasions. Every single day, granaries that could feed entire cities were emptied to produce a single feast. The contradiction was deliberate and pointed. While Mongol soldiers in the field survived on dried meat and fermented milk, proving their legendary toughness, the Khan gorged on delicacies from 3 continents, proving that the empire's reach extended to the very edges of the possible. The Yinshan Zhengyao, compiled in 1330 by the imperial physician Hu Sihui, gives us our most detailed window into this culinary madness. This wasn't just a cookbook. It was a manual for entertaining on an imperial scale, containing 268 recipes that read like fever dreams of excess. One recipe calls for wolf leg, seasoned with cardamom, black pepper, and saffron. Another describes preparing bear meat alongside delicate chicken dishes. These weren't just meals, they were edible declarations that the Khan's power extended over every living thing in his domain. But the real genius of imperial Mongol cuisine wasn't in its extravagance. It was in its diplomacy. Every dish told a story about conquest and integration. When Persian envoys were served familiar spices on Mongol horse meat, the message was crystal clear. Your people produce it, my people own it, and now I'm eating it in front of you. When Chinese officials were presented with their homeland's delicate rice wines alongside fermented mare's milk, they understood that their sophisticated traditions were now footnotes in a larger Mongol narrative. The drinking culture that developed around these feasts was legendary even by medieval standards. Arag remained the ceremonial centerpiece, but it was joined by an international cast of intoxicants that would make a modern sommelier weep with envy. Honey wine from the north, grape wines from Persia, rice wines from China, and distilled spirits that could reach 60 proof and probably strip paint from palace walls. The toasting rituals became exercises in endurance that could last for hours. Every cup raised required a response. Every diplomatic courtesy demanded another round. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that refusing to drink wasn't just rude. It was potentially treasonous. The ability to hold your liquor became a survival skill in a court where political alliances were cemented over shared hangovers. But perhaps The most revealing aspect of these imperial feasts was how they handled the fundamental Mongol division between red and white foods. Rather than abandoning their ancestral categories, the imperial court expanded them into something far more complex. The white foods now included not just dairy products, but rice, noodles, and grain-based dishes that represented the agricultural wealth of conquered territories. The red foods encompassed not just traditional livestock, but exotic game, seafood, and wild animals that demonstrated the empire's reach into every corner of the natural world. The seasonal eating patterns persisted too, but transformed by imperial resources. Summer feasts might feature fresh dairy products alongside chilled fruits imported from distant orchards. Winter banquets could include traditional preserved meats alongside fresh vegetables grown in heated greenhouses, a luxury that would have been unimaginable on the steppes. The cooking techniques themselves became fusion masterpieces. Traditional Mongol boiling methods were applied to Chinese ingredients. Persian spicing techniques were used on steppe game. Central Asian bread-making traditions were adapted to feed crowds that numbered in the thousands. The result was a cuisine that belonged to no single culture, but somehow represented them all. Consider the practical challenges. How do you maintain food safety when feeding tens of thousands of people with medieval technology? How do you ensure that dishes requiring precise timing all emerge from the kitchen simultaneously? How do you manage the logistics of preparing exotic ingredients that might arrive weeks or months apart? The imperial kitchen staff developed systems of organization and coordination that would impress modern restaurant managers. The hierarchy within these kitchens was as rigid and complex as the empire itself. Master cooks specialized in specific regional cuisines. Spice masters controlled access to the most expensive seasonings. Butchers were organized by the animals they processed. Even the pot washers were ranked according to their experience and trustworthiness. Failure at any level wasn't just professional embarrassment. It could be fatal. Yet, for all their sophistication, these imperial feasts maintained echoes of their steppe origins. The emphasis on abundance over delicacy, the preference for communal eating over individual portions, the integration of drinking rituals into every meal, the belief that hospitality was a form of warfare conducted through generosity rather than violence. The guests at these feasts understood the rules instinctively. You ate what was placed before you, regardless of personal preference. You drank when toasted, regardless of capacity. You praised the host's generosity, regardless of your actual opinion of the food. Survival in the imperial court required not just political acumen, but also a cast-iron stomach and the diplomatic skills of a seasoned ambassador. The entertainment that accompanied these meals was equally elaborate. Dancers performed between courses. Musicians provided soundtracks to match the mood of different dishes. Acrobats and storytellers filled the spaces between toasts. The entire experience was designed to overwhelm the senses, to create memories so vivid that guests would spend years describing what they had witnessed. But underneath all the spectacle, the fundamental Mongol relationship with food remained unchanged. Every meal was still about survival, just on an imperial scale. Every feast was still about demonstrating strength just through abundance rather than endurance. every dish was still about honoring the animals that died to create it, just with exotic spices and elaborate presentation. The legacy of these imperial feasts extended far beyond the Mongol court. Techniques developed to feed the Khan's household spread throughout the empire and beyond. Fusion dishes created in imperial kitchens became regional specialties. Cooking methods perfected for court banquets filtered down to local cuisines. The Mongol Empire's greatest cultural export wasn't just military tactics or administrative systems. It was a new understanding of what food could represent and accomplish. Today, when we sit down to elaborate meals that blend ingredients and techniques from multiple cultures, we're participating in a tradition that began in the courts of the great Khans. When restaurants boast of fusion cuisine that combines unexpected elements, they're echoing innovations first developed to feed the appetites of Mongol emperors. The idea that food can be diplomacy, entertainment, and cultural expression simultaneously has its roots in those medieval kitchens where the descendants of nomadic herders learned to rule the world one feast at a time. And speaking of ruling through feasts, let me tell you about the moment when everything changed for Mongol cuisine forever. It happened when Genghis Khan himself, the man who would unite the tribes and launch 1,000 conquests, learned his first lesson about the deadly politics of food. He was just a boy then, not yet the terror of nations, when he killed his own half-brother over a stolen fish and a bird he'd caught. Think about that for a second. The man who would eventually control the largest empire in human history committed his first murder not over territory or honor, but over dinner. That incident wasn't just childhood violence. It was a masterclass in the fundamental truth that would drive Mongol expansion for the next century. Control the food, control everything else. Genghis understood this lesson so completely that it shaped not just his military strategy, but the entire structure of Mongol society. When his armies swept across Asia, they weren't just conquering cities and kingdoms. They were absorbing entire food systems, collecting culinary techniques like other conquerors collected gold. But here's where the story gets really wild. The same man who once killed for a handful of fish would eventually sit at tables groaning under the weight of dishes that required ingredients from 3 continents. His descendants would dine on wolf soup seasoned with saffron worth more than most people's annual income. The transformation from desperate boy fighting over scraps to emperor whose kitchen staff numbered in the thousands is one of history's most dramatic examples of how power literally changes what's on your plate. The military campaigns that created this culinary empire were themselves exercises in food logistics that would make modern supply chain managers weep with admiration. Mongol warriors perfected the art of eating on horseback, not because they thought it was fun, but because stopping to cook meant giving your enemies time to escape or regroup. They carried leather pouches filled with meat, onions, and flour that would slowly cook from body heat and friction during long rides. By the time they stopped to rest, dinner was already prepared. This wasn't just convenient, it was revolutionary. While European armies required massive supply trains, and had to stop regularly to hunt and forage. Mongol forces could travel for weeks without breaking stride. Their horses weren't just transportation, they were mobile restaurants. Warriors would drink mare's milk directly from the source during brief stops, and in emergencies, they'd make small cuts in their mounts' necks to drink blood without seriously harming the animals. The psychological impact of this self-sufficiency was enormous. Imagine being a defender watching an enemy army approach that never seemed to need rest, never seemed to slow down for meals, never seemed constrained by the logistics that limited every other military force. The Mongols appeared almost supernatural in their endurance, and food was the secret weapon that made it possible. When these unstoppable armies finally did conquer settled civilizations, the cultural collision was spectacular. Picture Mongol generals, fresh from campaigns where they'd survived on fermented mare's milk and meat cooked under saddles, suddenly finding themselves responsible for governing populations that had spent centuries perfecting rice wine, elaborate spice blends, and cooking techniques that required specialized equipment and years of training. The smart move would have been to either ignore these foreign foods entirely or abandon Mongol traditions in favor of local customs. Instead, the Mongols did something far more interesting and ultimately more powerful. They created hybrid cuisines that took the best elements from both worlds while maintaining their cultural identity. This wasn't accidental cultural blending. It was deliberate imperial strategy disguised as dinner. Consider what happened in China after Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty. Traditional Chinese cuisine emphasized balance, subtlety, and seasonal harmony. Mongol food culture was built around abundance, practicality, and the celebration of animal protein. Instead of choosing one approach over the other, the imperial kitchens created something entirely new. Chinese cooking techniques were applied to traditional Mongol ingredients. Elaborate Mongol feasting traditions were combined with Chinese presentation aesthetics. The result was dishes that no culture had ever seen before. Imagine delicate Chinese dumplings stuffed with traditional Mongol horse meat. Picture Persian rice dishes seasoned with spices from India and cooked using techniques learned from Central Asian nomads. Think about traditional arrack served in Chinese porcelain cups, alongside wines imported from regions that most people couldn't even locate on a map. These fusion experiments weren't just happening in the imperial palace. Throughout the Mongol Empire, local cuisines were being transformed by contact with nomadic food traditions. In Persia, traditional stews began incorporating dairy techniques learned from Mongol administrators. In Russia, fermentation methods used for arag were adapted to local grains and fruits. The empire became a vast laboratory of culinary experimentation. But the most dramatic transformations happened at the very top of the imperial hierarchy, where feeding the Khan became an exercise in demonstrating the reach and power of the empire itself. Every meal had to prove that Mongol rule extended to the furthest corners of the known world. Spices had to come from the most distant lands. Cooking techniques had to represent the most sophisticated cultures. Animals had to be the most exotic and difficult to obtain. This created a peculiar form of culinary arms race. Court officials competed to present the Khan with increasingly elaborate and impossible dishes. If one minister brought wolf soup, the next had to find bear meat. If Persian saffron was impressive last month, this month required spices from even more remote locations. The imperial kitchen became a stage where political ambition was measured in the rarity and expense of ingredients. The purchasing power required to maintain this system was staggering. Contemporary accounts describe spice caravans arriving at the imperial capital with loads worth more than the annual tax revenue of entire provinces. Merchants traveled for months across some of the world's most dangerous trade routes, all to ensure that the Khan's dinner table could demonstrate imperial wealth and power. The psychological pressure on everyone involved was intense. Cooks weren't just preparing food, they were creating edible propaganda. A poorly seasoned dish wasn't just bad cooking. It was a failure to properly represent the empire's magnificence. Kitchen staff understood that their professional competence was being judged by standards that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with politics. This system created some of the most elaborate and expensive dishes in human history. The Yinshan Zhengyao contains recipes that read like medieval fever dreams of excess. Consider this recipe for imperial duck. The bird had to be fed a special diet for weeks before slaughter, stuffed with ingredients imported from multiple continents, cooked using techniques that required specialized equipment, and presented in a manner that demonstrated the cook's knowledge of artistic principles borrowed from several different cultures. The cost of preparing such a dish wasn't measured just in money, but in the coordination of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, the employment of specialists with knowledge passed down through generations, and the maintenance of supply chains that required diplomatic agreements with dozens of different rulers. A single meal at the Khan's table represented the successful functioning of systems that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet for all this sophistication, the fundamental Mongol understanding of food remained unchanged. Every elaborate dish was still evaluated according to principles learned on the steppes. Did it provide enough calories to sustain a warrior through battle? Could the preparation methods be adapted for military campaigns? Did the ingredients demonstrate control over resources that enemies might need? This practical foundation kept Mongol court cuisine from becoming purely decorative. Unlike some later imperial food traditions that emphasized appearance over nutrition, Mongol feasts remained fundamentally about feeding people efficiently and abundantly. The exotic spices and elaborate presentations were impressive, but underneath the spectacle was food designed to sustain an empire built on constant movement and endless conquest. The drinking rituals that accompanied these feasts were equally practical in their excess. Irog remained the ceremonial centerpiece, but it was supplemented by an international collection of alcoholic beverages that served specific diplomatic and social functions. Persian wine demonstrated cultural sophistication. Chinese rice wine showed appreciation for local traditions. Distilled spirits from Central Asia proved that the empire's reach extended to the most remote and dangerous regions. But the real genius of Mongol drinking culture wasn't in the variety of beverages available. It was in the social rituals that surrounded their consumption. Every toast was a political statement. Every shared cup was a diplomatic agreement. Every drinking contest was a test of loyalty and endurance that revealed character in ways that formal negotiations never could. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that surviving a Mongol feast required more than diplomatic immunity. It required the physical constitution of a seasoned warrior and the political instincts of a master negotiator. Refusing to drink was insulting. Drinking too much was dangerous. Finding the perfect balance between showing respect and maintaining dignity became an art form that could determine the fate of nations. The entertainment that surrounded these drinking rituals was equally strategic. Musicians weren't just providing background noise, they were creating emotional atmospheres that enhanced the political effectiveness of the feast. Dancers weren't just performing, they were demonstrating the cultural wealth and sophistication of the empire. Storytellers weren't just entertaining, they were reinforcing the historical narratives that justified Mongol rule. Every element of these imperial feasts was carefully orchestrated to create specific psychological effects on the guests. The overwhelming abundance of food demonstrated imperial wealth. The exotic ingredients proved global reach. The elaborate presentation showed cultural sophistication. The drinking rituals created bonds of shared experience. The entertainment reinforced imperial ideology. But perhaps most importantly, the sheer scale of these events demonstrated something that no amount of military display could match. They showed that the Mongol Empire had moved beyond simple conquest into the realm of sustainable governance. Anyone could burn a city and steal its treasures. Only a truly successful imperial system could absorb and transform the cultural traditions of dozens of different peoples into something new and magnificent. The guests at these feasts understood this message perfectly. They weren't just being fed. They were being educated about their place in a new world order where Mongol power extended not just over territories and armies, but over the very definition of civilization itself. The nomadic herders, who had once survived on fermented mare's milk and meat cooked under saddles, were now setting the standards for sophistication and excess that the rest of the world would spend centuries trying to match. And the most remarkable thing about this transformation, it happened within a single lifetime. Genghis Khan, who began his career killing for fish and birds, lived to see his empire create feasting traditions that would influence cuisine across 3 continents. The boy who once ate grass and roots to survive became the founder of a dynasty whose dinner parties would be remembered and imitated for centuries. This wasn't just personal success. It was proof of something profound about human adaptability and the power of systematic thinking applied to cultural problems. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they conquered the very concept of what it meant to eat well, transforming simple survival techniques into expressions of imperial grandeur that redefined luxury for the medieval world. The transformation didn't stop at the imperial table. It cascaded down through every level of Mongol society like spilled wine soaking into silk. provincial governors, military commanders, and wealthy merchants all began hosting their own elaborate feasts, each trying to capture some reflection of the imperial grandeur they'd witnessed at court. What had begun as nomadic survival techniques was evolving into a comprehensive philosophy of hospitality that would reshape dining culture across the known world. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The Mongols weren't just copying what they conquered, they were improving on it. Take their approach to spice usage, which would have made medieval European nobles weep with envy. While most cultures used expensive spices sparingly, treating them like precious medicines to be doled out drop by drop, the Mongols approached seasoning with the same overwhelming force they brought to military campaigns. When Mongol cooks got their hands on black pepper, they didn't sprinkle it delicately over a single dish. They buried entire roasted animals under clouds of it. When saffron arrived from Persia, worth more per pound than most people earned in a year, Mongol kitchens used it with such abundance that visiting dignitaries assumed it must grow wild somewhere in the steppes. This wasn't ignorance about the value of these ingredients. It was psychological warfare conducted through seasoning. Imagine being a Persian merchant who'd spent months crossing dangerous trade routes to deliver a small pouch of precious cardamom, only to watch Mongol cooks dump the entire contents into a single pot of wolf stew. The message was unmistakable. Your most valuable treasures are my everyday ingredients. Your greatest luxuries are my casual seasonings. The empire's reach is so vast and its wealth so immense that scarcity is a concept that no longer applies to us. This philosophy extended to every aspect of imperial dining. Where other cultures might serve small portions of expensive meats to demonstrate their refinement, Mongol feasts featured entire herds roasted simultaneously. Where sophisticated courts might offer guests a carefully selected wine chosen for its subtle qualities, Mongol banquets provided rivers of every alcoholic beverage known to the medieval world. The logistics of maintaining this level of excess were mind-boggling. Consider the ice houses alone. In an age before refrigeration, serving chilled drinks in summer required maintaining underground storage facilities, stocked with blocks of ice carved from distant mountains and transported across hundreds of miles of desert and steppe. The fuel costs, the labor requirements, the coordination with ice harvesters working in conditions that regularly killed people, all to ensure that the Khan could demonstrate his power over the seasons themselves. The kitchen staff who managed these operations weren't just cooks. They were logistics coordinators, diplomatic negotiators, and cultural translators all rolled into one. A master chef might find himself managing supply chains that stretched from Korea to Hungary, coordinating the arrival of ingredients that had to be perfectly timed despite traveling at the speed of horse-drawn caravans across terrain controlled by potentially hostile forces. The consequences of failure were severe, but was immense, and the rewards for success were equally extraordinary. Cooks who could successfully manage these impossible demands found themselves elevated to positions of genuine political influence. They became trusted advisors to princes, confidants of generals, and sometimes the only people who could speak honestly to rulers whose word was literally life or death for millions of people. The techniques they developed to handle these challenges became legendary. Mongol cooks invented preservation methods that allowed fresh ingredients to survive journeys that would have defeated traditional approaches. They created cooking systems that could scale from feeding a small diplomatic party to hosting banquets for tens of thousands without losing quality or timing. They developed tasting protocols that could detect poison, spoilage, or simple incompetence with a precision that would impress modern food scientists. But perhaps their greatest innovation was in the realm of cultural fusion itself. These weren't just cooks throwing together random ingredients from different traditions. They were culinary diplomats creating new dishes that could speak to multiple audiences simultaneously. A single soup might use Mongol hunting techniques to prepare the meat, Chinese methods to cook the grains, Persian spices for seasoning, and Central Asian presentation styles for serving. The result was cuisine that belonged to no single culture, but somehow honored them all. Guests from different regions could recognize familiar elements while being introduced to completely new combinations and techniques. It was edible diplomacy at its most sophisticated, creating shared experiences that transcended cultural boundaries and political differences. No, the social rituals that developed around these fusion dishes were equally complex. Different courses required different etiquette depending on their cultural origins. Persian-influenced dishes might be eaten with elaborate ceremony and formal toasts. Chinese-style preparations called for different serving protocols and appreciation techniques. Mongol traditional foods demanded their own specific rituals of respect and consumption. Navigating these shifting expectations required guests to be cultural chameleons, adapting their behavior multiple times throughout a single meal. It was exhausting, overwhelming, and absolutely brilliant as a demonstration of imperial power. The Khan wasn't just feeding his guests, he was forcing them to acknowledge the diversity and sophistication of his empire with every bite. The entertainment that accompanied these cultural fusion feasts was equally strategic. Musicians might perform traditional Mongol throat singing, followed by Chinese court music, followed by Persian classical compositions, all within the span of a single course. Dancers might demonstrate steppe folk traditions, then imperial court choreography, then regional variations from newly conquered territories. The message was always the same. This empire encompasses everything you know and everything you don't know yet. Your cultural traditions are now part of something larger and more magnificent than anything you could have imagined. Resistance isn't just futile. It's meaningless in the face of this overwhelming cultural absorption. Yet, for all their sophistication, these imperial feasts maintained echoes of their brutal origins. The abundance might be overwhelming, but it was still built on the fundamental Mongol principle that strength came from the ability to take what you needed from a hostile world. The exotic spices might be impressive, but they were still seasoning meat that had been killed according to ancient steppe traditions that honored both the animal's sacrifice and the harsh realities of survival. The drinking rituals might be elaborate diplomatic exercises, but they were still rooted in the nomadic understanding that sharing fermented mare's milk created bonds strong enough to survive the deadly politics of tribal warfare. The entertainment might be culturally diverse and artistically sophisticated, but it still served the same function as traditional steppe storytelling, reinforcing group identity and celebrating the victories that made survival possible. This tension between sophistication and brutality, between cultural absorption and cultural dominance, created a unique dining atmosphere that both fascinated and terrified contemporary observers. Foreign diplomats wrote letters describing feasts that seemed to exist in multiple worlds simultaneously. Civilized enough to impress the most sophisticated courts, yet savage enough to remind everyone present that these were still the descendants of people who had conquered half the world through sheer force of will. The hygiene standards at these events would have horrified modern health inspectors, but they reflected practical realities that most contemporary critics simply didn't understand. When you're feeding thousands of people using medieval technology in a world without reliable food safety protocols, certain compromises become inevitable. The Mongols developed their own approaches to these challenges based on principles learned during military campaigns where contaminated food could destroy an army more effectively than any enemy force. Massive communal serving vessels eliminated individual portion contamination. Abundant spicing helped preserve food and disguise minor spoilage. Strong alcoholic beverages served as both social lubricant and primitive disinfectant. Dogs roaming freely under tables provided efficient waste disposal, while also serving as early warning systems for food that had gone truly bad. These weren't elegant solutions, but they were effective ones developed by people who understood that survival mattered more than aesthetics. The serving protocols themselves became elaborate performances that demonstrated imperial organization and cultural sophistication. Armies of servers, each with specific roles and responsibilities, moved through the dining areas with military precision. The timing of course delivery, the coordination of beverage service, the management of entertainment between dishes, all required planning and execution that would challenge modern event coordinators working with contemporary technology. The costumes worn by service staff were themselves diplomatic statements. Servers might wear traditional Mongol clothing while serving steppe dishes, then change into Chinese court dress for the next course, then don Persian-style garments for dessert service. The visual impact reinforced the culinary message. This empire encompasses and commands all the world's traditions. The financial costs of maintaining this system were staggering, even by imperial standards. Contemporary records suggest that feeding the court and its guests consumed a larger percentage of imperial revenue than military campaigns. This wasn't waste or extravagance for its own sake. It was strategic investment in the kind of soft power that could accomplish things that armies alone never could. When foreign rulers received detailed descriptions of Mongol feasting traditions, they understood immediately that they were dealing with a power that operated on a completely different scale from anything they had previously encountered. The military conquests proved that the Mongols could destroy their enemies. The feasting traditions proved that they could also absorb, transform, and improve upon everything they conquered. This cultural confidence was perhaps the most threatening aspect of Mongol expansion. It was one thing to lose a battle or even a war to a superior military force. It was something else entirely to discover that your conquerors weren't just going to rule your territory, but were going to take your most sophisticated cultural achievements and use them as raw materials for creating something even more impressive. The psychological impact on conquered peoples was profound. Traditional resistance strategies assumed that foreign conquerors would either destroy local culture or remain forever alien to it. The Mongol approach of selective absorption and creative transformation left traditional resistance leaders without clear targets or effective arguments. How do you organize cultural resistance against conquerors who appreciate your traditions enough to incorporate the best elements into their own system? How do you maintain separate identity when your most cherished customs are being celebrated and preserved just as components of something larger and more magnificent than you had imagined possible? The dining halls where these cultural negotiations played out became theaters of imperial psychology. Every meal was a lesson in the New World Order. Every dish demonstrated the futility of maintaining separate cultural boundaries. Every toast reinforced the benefits of cooperation with the new imperial system. Yet the genius of the Mongol approach was that it never felt completely oppressive to the people experiencing it. Yes, their traditional foods were being transformed and incorporated into something foreign, but they were also being elevated, celebrated, and shared with audiences that would never have encountered them otherwise. Local cooks found themselves working with ingredients and techniques that their ancestors could never have imagined accessing. Regional specialties that had been limited to small geographic areas suddenly became components of an international cuisine that stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Traditional recipes that had been passed down through families for generations were being preserved in imperial cookbooks that would survive long after local oral traditions might have been lost. This cultural preservation through transformation created complicated emotional responses among conquered peoples. Pride in seeing their traditions celebrated at the highest levels of imperial society. Resentment at watching foreign rulers claim credit for achievements that belonged to their ancestors. Excitement about the new possibilities created by access to ingredients and techniques from across the known world. Anxiety about the loss of cultural autonomy and distinct identity. The dining experiences themselves became mirrors of these complex emotions. A Chinese official might feel simultaneous pride and humiliation while watching Mongol cooks prepare traditional dishes with expensive ingredients that local restaurants could never afford. A Persian merchant might experience both gratitude and resentment when offered familiar wines at prices that demonstrated the empire's vast wealth, while highlighting his own relative poverty. These psychological dynamics were exactly what Mongol leaders intended to create. Emotional ambivalence was far more effective than simple fear or hatred at preventing organized resistance. People who weren't sure whether they were being honored or insulted, elevated or diminished, were unlikely to organize effective opposition movements. The long-term cultural consequences of this strategy extended far beyond the Mongol Empire's political boundaries or temporal duration. Cooking techniques developed in imperial kitchens spread throughout the trade networks that connected Asia to Europe and Africa. Spice combinations created for court banquets became regional standards that influenced local cuisines for centuries. Presentation styles pioneered for diplomatic feasts became artistic traditions that shaped cultural aesthetics across multiple civilizations. Modern fusion cuisine, with its emphasis on combining techniques and ingredients from different cultural traditions, has its roots in the experimental kitchens of the Mongol Empire. The idea that food can serve as cultural diplomacy, that meals can be political statements, that dining can be a form of soft power projection, all trace back to innovations first developed to feed the appetites of nomadic conquerors who understood that lasting empire required more than military dominance. The transformation of simple steppe survival techniques into sophisticated imperial cuisine represents one of history's most dramatic examples of cultural evolution accelerated by political necessity. Within the span of a few generations, the descendants of people who cooked meat under their saddles were setting global standards for luxury, sophistication, and cultural integration that influenced dining traditions across 3 continents. And at the center of it all sat the great Khan himself, no longer the desperate boy who had once killed for fish and fowl, but the master of an empire whose dinner table had become a stage for demonstrating that human appetite, properly channeled and magnificently supplied, could reshape civilization itself. The end of a feast in Kublai Khan's court wasn't really an ending at all. It was more like the final movement of a symphony that had been building for hours, where every note had been calculated to leave the audience both satisfied and somehow hungry for more. As the last of the exotic desserts disappeared and the final toasts echoed through halls thick with incense and the lingering aroma of a dozen different cuisines, guests understood that they hadn't just attended a dinner. They had witnessed a master class in imperial theater. But what happened after these legendary feasts tells us everything about the true genius of Mongol food culture. While other empires might have treated such elaborate displays as isolated events, the Mongols understood that the real power of food lay not in single spectacular moments, but in creating systems that could sustain spectacle indefinitely. The cleanup alone required armies of servants working through the night, not just washing dishes and clearing tables, but carefully preserving and redistributing leftover ingredients according to protocols that had been refined through decades of practice. Nothing was wasted, ever. Exotic spices that hadn't been used were stored in temperature-controlled chambers. Partially consumed dishes were transformed into new preparations for the next day's meals. Even the bones from roasted animals were processed into broths that would form the foundations for future soups. The Mongols had learned on the steppes that waste was death, and no amount of imperial luxury could shake them from that fundamental understanding. The morning after a great feast was when the real diplomacy began. Ambassadors who had been overwhelmed by spectacle the night before now had to process what they had witnessed and translate it into reports for their home governments. How do you explain to a European king that you've just watched nomadic horsemen demonstrate a level of culinary sophistication that makes the most elaborate court dinners look like peasant meals? How do you describe dishes that required ingredients your own kingdom couldn't obtain and cooking techniques that no one in your homeland had ever imagined? So here we are, at the end of our journey through the kitchens and dining halls that fed the greatest empire in human history. From the wind-swept steppes, where desperate nomads learned to transform mare's milk into liquid courage, to the opulent palaces, where their descendants turned dinner into an art form that redefined civilization itself. The story of feeding the great Khan is really the story of human ambition made edible. It's about people who refused to accept that survival was enough, who took the harsh lessons of nomadic life and transformed them into expressions of imperial grandeur that still echo through our modern understanding of what food can represent and accomplish. Every time you sit down to a fusion meal that blends ingredients from multiple cultures, you're participating in a tradition that began with Mongol cooks trying to honor both their steppe heritage and their conquered territories. Every elaborate dinner party, every carefully planned menu that tells a story about hospitality and cultural sophistication traces its DNA back to those medieval kitchens where the descendants of horse-riding nomads learned to rule the world one impossible feast at a time. The Mongols proved something profound about human nature and the relationship between power and appetite. They showed us that true imperial strength isn't just about the ability to destroy your enemies. It's about the capacity to absorb, transform, and improve upon everything you encounter, creating something magnificent from the raw materials of conquest. Tonight, when you raise a glass or share a meal with friends, remember that somewhere in that simple act of hospitality lives the ghost of ancient toasts and impossible feasts, the echo of a time when dinner wasn't just about feeding the body, but about feeding the very soul of empire itself. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride through history's most extravagant dinner parties. If this story of culinary conquest and imperial appetite fascinated you as much as it did me, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world, and let me know in the comments which historical feast you'd want to attend if you could travel back in time. Trust me, after tonight's story, your own dinner is going to taste just a little bit different.